In this video, we're going to talk about a large family of closely related organelles located within the cell, which are grouped together under the name endomembrane system. Now, if we break down the name of this system, the name becomes rather intuitive. Endo, of course, is the prefix that means inside, meaning we're predominantly going to be looking at components found inside the cell, and membrane is a reference to two parts of the cell that we've looked at already, the first of which is the cell membrane, of course, which forms the barrier between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell, and ultimately protects the inside of the cell and controls what is able to get in or out of the cell. The second example of a membrane that we've seen before is, of course, the nuclear membrane that does the same thing as the cell membrane, only its job specifically is to protect the most important part of your cell, the DNA, which ultimately is the control center molecule for the rest of the cell, which explains why it needs its own protective structure. Now, the other reason why the organelles of the endomembrane system connect to both the cell membrane and the nuclear membrane is actually in their chemical composition as well. All organelles of the endomembrane system are made of the same components, which are what we call a phospholipid bilayer. So a bilayer implies that there is a layer of two layers, in this case, of molecules that are called phospholipids, which is a modified type of fat that makes up the cell membrane, the nuclear membrane, and every other component of the endomembrane system. And even though the chemistry is not our focus for this introductory lesson, it's important to know that all organelles of the endomembrane system share this common structure, which allows them to work together and interface with each other very easily. Now, first off, when we introduce the largest member of the endomembrane system, an organelle that we call the endoplasmic reticulum, it's actually important to talk about what the endoplasmic reticulum does in relation to the nucleus in order to be able to see how it fits with the rest of the cell. So, as mentioned previously, the nuclear membrane is a part of the endomembrane system that exists to protect your cell's DNA. Under normal circumstances, DNA never ever leaves the nucleus. The only reason why you would have DNA outside of the nucleus is if the nuclear membrane is damaged in some way, which means that the cell is in trouble. Now, your DNA is ultimately the control molecule of the rest of the cell, because your DNA ultimately decides which proteins and how much protein your cell is going to produce. And because proteins perform all of the major functions of the cell, this is how DNA ultimately controls the direction of the cell. Now, the problem is that DNA is not actually able to do this directly because DNA never leaves the nucleus. So instead, DNA produces an intermediate molecule that we call RNA, and RNA's job is actually to leave the nucleus and tell the endoplasmic reticulum, which we will call the ER for short, which proteins to produce, how many proteins to produce, and ultimately where these proteins are going to end up. Therefore, the analogy that we often use of DNA is that DNA functions more or less as a library containing all of the information that this cell could possibly need, whereas you can think of the RNA as an individual book that you would borrow from the library, which is why we describe RNA as a carrier of the information from your genetic code rather than the library itself, because it actually takes specific information from your DNA and carries it to the outside of the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, you'll notice here that I drew the RNA only going to the left-hand side of the endoplasmic reticulum because the ER is actually divided into two distinct halves based on differences in structure and differences in function. The left-hand side is what we call the rough ER or RER for short. And we can see in this structural diagram here that there are little green dots that are all found on the surface of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, but not on the right-hand side here. Those little green dots, if we zoom in on one of them, they would look like this, and these are, of course, one of the most important organelles in the cell, your ribosomes, and the job of a ribosome is to take the RNA that is released out of the nucleus that carries information from your DNA, and the RNA is fed through a ribosome that reads the ribosome, the ribosome reads the RNA, and based on the information in the RNA is going to produce a specific protein that is usually necessary not within the cell but outside of the cell, and ultimately most of the proteins that are produced in the RER are actually bound for export outside of the cell. There are a few exceptions to these, so we can see that as this protein is being produced by the ribosome, we see that this protein is taking on a specific shape. Now, proteins don't normally do this by themselves. Normally, they need help from other proteins, so some of the proteins that are produced in the RER exist to stay in the RER in order to help proteins that are being produced to fold properly and take on their proper shape so that they can do the job that is necessary for them. Now we can see the second half of the endoplasmic reticulum here does not have ribosomes on the surface. Instead of having a rough surface, the right-hand side of the ER has a smooth surface, which is why we call this the SER, or smooth endoplasmic reticulum for short. Now, because there are no ribosomes on the surface of the SER, proteins are not produced here, and instead the smooth ER's job is to produce the cell's lipids. So lipids is a large family of closely related nutrients or molecules that all have in common the idea that they dissolve very poorly in water. So fats that your body uses for energy, which also includes the phospholipids that make up the structure of the cell membrane itself, this is one category of lipids that are produced by the SER. So without the SER, you would not actually have a cell membrane or an endomembrane system, because all of the phospholipids are ultimately produced here. The other family of lipid-based nutrients produced in the SER are what we call steroid molecules, an example of which is this molecule here, and many steroids that are produced in cells function as hormones, which are chemicals that one cell will use to communicate with another cell in a different location in the body. So in summary, we can see that the primary purpose of both the rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum is a major production center that takes information provided by the DNA in the nucleus in the form of RNA that is exported out of the cell in order to tell the RER which proteins to make and the SER which lipid molecules to make. In the second half of this video, we're going to look at what happens to the products of the RER and the SER and how they are transported not just within the cell, but also out of the cell if necessary.